Vous savez, ce qui me chiffonne le plus en vous, c'est que vous vous dérobez. Vous ne prenez pas vos responsabilités. Vous êtes un chrétien honteux, doublé d'un don juan honteux. C'est bien le comble.
Mais non, c'est faux. J'ai aimé, c'est très différent. J'ai aimé 2 ou 3 femmes dans ma vie. Enfin, disons 3 ou 4. J'ai vécu avec elles des périodes très longues qui ont duré plusieurs années. Je ne les ai peut-être pas aimées follement. Oh, si, tout de même. Assez follement. Et il y a eu réciprocité. Je ne dis pas ça pour me vanter.
Pas de fausse modestie.
Non, je dis ça parce que je ne pense pas qu'il y ait vraiment d'amour sans réciprocité. C'est d'ailleurs ce qui me ferait croire à une certaine prédestination. C'est très bien que ça ait été et c'est très bien que ça ait raté.
C'est vous qui avez rompu.
Non, ni elle, mais les circonstances.
Il aurait fallu les surmonter.
Des circonstances qui ne pouvaient pas être surmontées. Enfin, oui, je sais, on peut toujours. Mais ça aurait été en dépit de toute raison, complètement fou, idiot. Non, non, c'était impossible. Il fallait que ça ne soit pas possible. Il valait mieux que ça ne le soit pas. Vous voyez?
Oui, oui, je comprends très bien. Ça me paraît très humain, mais très peu chrétien.
Oui. De toute façon, pour en revenir à ce que je disais, chrétien ou pas, peu importe. Mettons la religion entre parenthèses, je ne me pose pas du tout de ce point de vue. Les femmes m'ont beaucoup apporté moralement. Quand je dis les femmes, c'est un peu...
Oui, c'est un peu vulgaire.
Oui. Chaque fois que j'ai connu une fille, de toute façon, ça a toujours été un cas particulier, ce serait idiot de parler en général. Cela m'a découvert un problème moral que j'ignorais, auquel je n'avais pas eu à faire face concrètement. J'ai eu à prendre une attitude qui pour moi a été bénéfique, qui m'a sorti de ma léthargie morale.
Mais vous pouviez très bien assumer le côté moral et laisser la chose physique.
Oui, mais le moral n'apparaissait, n'existait même que... Ah oui, bien sûr, je sais, on peut toujours tout. Mais physique et morale sont indissociables. Il faut quand même voir les choses comme elles sont.
Ça n'était peut-être qu'un piège du démon.
Eh bien, j'y serais tombé. Ah oui, d'une certaine façon, j'y suis tombé. Si je n'y étais pas tombé, j'aurais été un saint.
Et vous ne voulez pas être un saint?
Non, pas du tout.
Oh, qu'est-ce qu'il ne faut pas entendre? Je croyais que tout chrétien devait aspirer à la sainteté.
Quand je dis je ne veux pas, je veux dire je ne peux pas.
Quel défaitisme. Et la grâce?
Je demande à la grâce de me faire entrevoir la possibilité de l'être.
This is Criteria. Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. I'm James Majewski here with my co-host, Thomas Maris.
Hello.
Hey. So, right off the bat, I want to thank everyone who contributed to our fall fundraising campaign. We hit our goal right at the end. Thanks to everyone who prayed for us or contributed. And if you didn't, you can still do so. You're looking at your end of year giving and you're thinking, hey, I got some money to burn. Head over to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. And
Yes.
your donation will be earmarked for this podcast and all of our audio development. But yeah, here we are. We're doing
Christmas
our Christmas
episode.
special.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Last year we did It's a Wonderful Life. This year we're doing a very different film.
Very different.
And that also, well, no, that wasn't on the Vatican film list. So neither of our Christmas specials have been on the Vatican film list, nor was A Fat Man, starring Mel Gibson.
Right.
As Santa Claus, the other Christmas movie we discussed. But we are discussing a film that plausibly should have been on the Vatican film list.
Right.
I'm interested to know why none of this filmmaker's films made it on, because we're discussing a French Catholic filmmaker, Eric Rohmer, and we're discussing his kind of, not his first film, but his first really well-known film, My Night at Maud's. And we have here to discuss this film with us, a real Rohmer aficionado, Matthew Schmitz. Matthew is a senior editor at First Things and a columnist at The American Conservative, and he's written a number of essays on Rohmer, including a couple for First Things, and that's sort of how we found him and decided to have him on. But of course, I've enjoyed his work, various other topics at First Things over the years as well. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to come on to talk to you two and just participate in the work of CatholicCulture.org, which I've enjoyed for a long time. I remember when I was in college reading a blog on CatholicCulture.org by Diogenes, a pseudonymous blogger, later alleged to be Father Paul Mankowski, the late and dearly missed Paul Mankowski, and then of course Jeff Mears, Phil Lawler, others on the site over the years. So great to be with you guys.
Yes, thank you. Well, it was indeed partially Father Mankowski, and later Phil Lawler did a few after Father Mankowski couldn't do it anymore. But, Ignatius just released a collection of essays by Father Mankowski, but they're releasing a second one taken entirely from his writings as Diogenes,
Wow.
I think early next year, that Phil Lawler is editing.
Oh, wow.
So that'll be actually Catholic Culture's first book.
That's fantastic.
Which is kind of cool. It's all from our website, which is kind of exciting.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and all
I
of that
didn't know
Diogenes stuff is still up there on Catholic Culture. You can go and look into our archives and find all of that material. I spent a little time digging through there myself after Father Paul Mankowski passed away. Yeah. There's some rich stuff.
Yeah, highly recommended. People should really take the time. And I think Father Paul also did some longer things for Catholic Culture, maybe under his own name, that are worth reading.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, James actually hosts another podcast called Catholic Culture Audiobooks, where he reads mostly works by the Fathers and Newman, but also some more contemporary things. And he's recorded. James is an actor, and he's recorded 2 essays by Father Mankowski, neither of which were published at CatholicCulture.org originally, but I think they're both in the
library.
Yes, they're in the library, or at least one of them is, and I think they're both in this First Ignatius Press collection as well. Namely, one of those essays was "What Went Wrong."
What went wrong, and then the other is "Thames in Clerical Life."
Thames in Clerical Life, both great essays, making a great introduction to his work.
Definitely,
for sure.
Definitely.
Okay, so Matthew, we're kind of always happy to find Orthodox Catholic thinkers who are into this sort of thing, because, as you can imagine, a Catholic film podcast that discusses a lot of European black and white films is kind of a niche product. We've mainly been going through the Vatican film list. It's mostly continental films from decades ago. And so, it may be hard to find an audience, but in a sense, it's even harder to find suitable guests to discuss these films with us. So we're always really happy to find someone who shares that interest. So this is our first experience with Rohmer for both James and I. So you're familiar with his whole filmography, more or less, it seems like. So can you give us and our audience just a general introduction to Rohmer?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. Rohmer was part of the so-called French New Wave, a group that started out writing criticism of French film around Cahiers du Cinéma, French journal, and then went into filmmaking. And he was an older member of that group and started as a filmmaker a bit later than some of the others did, at least in terms of his work that made it to the public. And he's certainly the most religiously minded member of that group, and I think really the one whose work proved to be the most enduring, in that he continued over the course of decades into the 2000s, I believe, with The Romance of Estrée and Celadon, his last film, or nearly last film. Maybe Triple Agent is the last. but he continued into the 2000s. And so over the course of many decades was making quality films, and he just showed a lot more, had a much longer shelf life, I think, than some of his peers who were maybe more initially celebrated. And I think that was connected with some of his abiding concerns, which I think are close to the heart of this podcast, concerns having to do with, faith, not just in the sense of religious commitment, but in terms of, fidelity to a woman or an idea. He was very interested in those things. And so though his films only occasionally treat religious themes explicitly, they are suffused with concerns that I think are felt by anyone who tries to live by a certain rule, or someone who maybe holds certain beliefs that aren't accepted by all of one's peers. Those themes reappear throughout his films, and we certainly see them in My Night at Maud's.
Right. So this film we're talking about, My Night at Maud's, is one of 6 films, 6 moral tales. I think this is the third one.
Fourth.
Yeah. Oh, the fourth?
Yeah.
Now
1969 this came out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that this was my introduction to Rohmer. Frankly, I'm surprised that his name had never come up on my radar before. I'm no film buff exactly, but I've seen plenty of art films, plenty of foreign films. I'm not totally ignorant of the canon of great film, but Eric Rohmer just totally went by me.
Yeah.
And I was delighted to watch this movie.
Yeah.
I loved it so much. But I also have no way of contextualizing it in context of his broader work, but also specifically these 6 moral tales. So could you speak a little bit to that? Is this something that really operates together with these other films? Do you need to watch them in sequence? Is it kind of like Decalogue, another series of films that we've been covering on the podcast here? Because I'm just totally in the dark on this.
Yeah, I mean, I often like to watch genre films that have certain kind of set conventions, and part of the pleasure is seeing the variations between various genre films, be it a film noir or a gangster film or a western. And one thing that Rohmer did throughout his career was create series of films. So you have the 6 moral tales, and then later in his career you have the 4 seasons. And you can kind of connect other films of his. There are certain kind of recurring themes or structures. And what you see in each one of the 6 moral tales is this basic structure. A man has an initial commitment to some woman, and then he is drawn toward another woman, and then at the end he returns to the first woman. And so this commitment can be very unserious. And what's really just a film short, The Bakery Girl of Monceau, there's a man wandering down the street, and he sees a woman frequently, and he means to talk to her, but then all of a sudden he stops seeing her. One day he no longer sees her. On the very day he resolves to speak to her. And so then, as he's looking for her, he's distracted by a second woman, and then in the end he returns to the first. And then we see something almost like this in My Night at Maud's. Our hero, an engineer at the Michelin plant in Clermont-Ferrand, France, a provincial city, which in this film we see blanketed in snow, contrasting beautifully with the black stone of the city's cathedral, built from the igneous rock from the local volcano.
Wow.
So we see these strong contrasts. He spies a woman at Mass, and then he spends, the titular night at the home of Maud, a second woman. And then he ends up returning to the first woman. So this structure, initial commitment, a certain deviation, and then a return to the initial commitment, that reaches its culmination in the last of the moral tales, or at least its most explicit form in the last of the moral tales, where you have a married man who very nearly commits adultery, and then at the end of the film returns to his wife. And so in the moral tales, this commitment can be very, very unserious. You just see a girl on the street, or maybe you see a girl at mass, and that's just an idea in his head. He has no relationship with the woman. He's almost stalking her. There's not really any.
Right.
He's not bound to her in any way, but so the man is not being a good Catholic by remaining faithful to that initial idea of the woman. I mean, he may be a good Catholic by not, say, sleeping with another one, fornication being a sin. But what the particular type of fidelity he's showing is to an idea of a woman. And there is a real integrity in that, and it is an indication of his moral seriousness.
A lot of this film is just discussion. I mean, pretty much all of this film is just discussion in different places, and sometimes going from one place to another. And the centerpiece is, of course, the night at Maud's. And a good chunk of the discussion in this film, some of it is about relationships between men and women. Some of it is about inconsistencies between our beliefs and our actions. But a big chunk of the philosophical core of this film has to do with the philosophy of Pascal, who is read by the main character and discussed with him with two other characters in the film. Now, I read that Rohmer had directed a few episodes of a French television series, in one of which he interviewed two philosophers about Pascal, one of whom was a Dominican priest. And I watched this earlier today, and because it's in the Criterion extras. And it was the debate between these philosophers about Pascal that inspired those aspects of the film. I don't know that I have a very strong grasp on the relationship between some of the ideas of Pascal discussed in the film and the plot of the film. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Matthew.
Yeah, well, I mean, this film was made in 1968, which was a revolutionary moment in France, or at least an apparently revolutionary moment. You have the famous events of May 1968, when students took to the streets of the Latin Quarter and proclaimed it is forbidden to forbid. And so, Rohmer's film coming out the next year is coming out in a context where, a context in which everything, any sort of prohibition or restriction or rule is being questioned in France. And, Rohmer's film was a surprising success because it cuts against that cultural current in a certain way. You have characters who are, participating in the currents of the time, who are experimenting with certain forms of freedom, experimenting sexually, or our engineer, our hero, he travels around the globe before returning to this, French provincial city. He works in Canada, he works in Chile, and Rohmer, I think, brings Pascal in part to put a sort of, Pascal permits the characters to speak about freedom in a certain way, and specifically about the kind of enjoyment, or the enjoyment of liberties that was so much at heart of the events of May 1968. So Pascal, who was very austere in his morality, participating, as really the greatest exponent of French Jansenism, which sought a more high and pure morality. That's Pascal. So he's at the more severe pole, and then our hero says, "Well, I'm not like Pascal. I'm really," or he's accused of being more like a Jesuit, which is to say that he believes that it's okay to enjoy your food, it's okay to enjoy your wine, and even sins probably will happen and should be forgiven, and there's just a less rigorous morality being preached by our hero. And so in part the contention of our Catholic hero is that the church can encompass both poles of severity and relative laxity. Of course, that only goes so far. There are limits, and we discover them. Even though he's a very liberal Christian, so to speak, and will enjoy his wine, he thinks that he should not sleep with a woman. At least he should not sleep with a woman without love, and when he has any kind of commitment to another woman. And he absolutely rejects divorce. So he's very loosey-goosey, he claims, but there are certain very hard limits that you run up against in his morality.
Yeah, it's interesting because this main character, he is on the one hand sort of pushing back against what he sees to be the austerity of Pascal, and then on the other hand, is basically the most austere character that we encounter in the film. There's four main characters. There's Jean-Louis, who is the engineer we've been talking about. There's his friend Vidal, who's a Marxist philosophy professor at the local university. There's Maud, who's a pediatrician and whose apartment they go to visit the day after Christmas. Or I guess it's Christmas night, rather. And then there's Francoise. Francoise, yeah. She's the blonde woman with whom Jean-Louis becomes enamored, after he sees her at Mass. Yeah. And she becomes kind of the object of his love and his pursuit.
Yes, he says he knew that she would be his wife.
Right, right. But, we come to find out that even in her instance, she has had an affair. She's enabled an affair by taking a married man as a lover. Vidal is a total, what's the word? He's a kind of playboy. Mm-hmm. And Maud is also, she's called a free thinker. Never been baptized, but she's a divorcee, and we are also given to
seductress.
Yeah, right. So Jean-Louis, is kind of in the midst of this, being the only one seemingly who has sort of hard moral lines, and acts on principle in his own way. He's a very principled man, but it's not, as you mentioned, a fully Catholic, like a fully robust Catholic moral sense. It is kind of something that I don't know. I don't want to say that it's half baked, but it's kind of flirting with the world, and doesn't seem to have a kind of urgency to convert behind it.
He talks
necessarily
about how he's mediocre, and he doesn't really isn't really convinced that everybody can be a saint.
Right.
And so he thinks that he can acquire a certain justness in the biblical sense of the word, he claims, even with his mediocrity and his half-heartedness, even though he says that God creates his half-heartedness. So, and he also, there's just like, he's always talking about the way he makes decisions and chance, and how his decisions are easy. And I'm never quite sure where he's coming from in this, the way he thinks about his moral life.
Is the sex bureaucracy for you?
Excuse me, I'm recording a podcast. We can edit it out. But with a couple guys about Catholic film, this is good, Rusty. This is going to be this is about the Title IX bureaucracy.
That's right. Oh, good. Yeah. Good. All right.
You're off to
Hello,
Poland.
Rusty Reno. Many honors to you, Editor-in-Chief.
I don't leave till midnight.
My hosts say many honors to you, my young Catholic hosts.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, guys.
Cameo. I think we should keep that in. Cameo from the Editor-in-Chief.
So I mean, one thing we see, our hero, he definitely presents himself as aspiring to a middle class Christianity, so to speak. He doesn't think he's called to be a saint, just to be a just man in a more modest sense, or he puts it in a biblical sense. And then the film makes a point of making clear that it's not only our hero who is loyal to a certain tradition, with its teachings, its ways. It's also Maud, who comes from an old free-thinking family, and so Jean-Louis, our hero, and then Maud, they represent two opposed strands of the French tradition, and one is Catholic, bourgeois, conservative. The other one is free-thinking, Republican, at times bohemian, and so their flirtation has certain political and kind of historic aspect. It's it shows how maybe in this moment of disorientation, figures who come from two very different streams of the French tradition might be attracted to each other. Maud she's quite attracted to the Catholic ideas and the scruples and hang-ups of our character. Even as she prods him, she finds him fascinating, precisely because he is hung up in certain ways. And likewise, our hero is quite attracted to this woman who is not simply without principle or scruple. She instead seems to be deliberately living out a modern existence, trying to follow her own logic, which extends from the modern furniture in her apartment to her sleeping nude always, as she makes a point of saying, and even to her openness to love, or to love with a man. There's a kind of consistent type of life being lived out by her, and it's one where sin doesn't enter into the picture. Right? She would not sin in her eyes by sleeping with the hero. She would instead be really living by her own principles. Not that they command it, but they totally accept it, and she would do so, or she would at least try to do so, without any feeling of shame or regret.
There's a certain complacency in Jean-Louis, the main character. For example, they're talking about having flings or one night stands, and he says, "I won't say God, but fate has kept me from such circumstances," which he acts as though it could just never happen to him. And I think that it's, in the end, it is his choice. Well, so they almost sleep, they almost have sex, and they he stops, but then she gets up and goes across the room, and he sort of chases her, and then she rejects him at that point. So I suppose it is still circumstances, protecting him in that sense, but he doesn't acknowledge the role that God plays in these things. He thinks that it's just, well, I'm just not the sort of person who ends up doing those things. There's like a complacency, a failure to own the role of grace in it, which allows him to keep having this sort of embrace of his own mediocrity. And so it's interesting that the film highlights this idea of true and false conversion, that both of the characters sort of question the reality of the conversion that he claims to have had, because they're discussing his past life, his past love affairs, and how they can relate to his Catholic faith. And then when he's later at the, I don't know what you'd call it, a dormitory or something, where the girl Francoise that he's interested in from the beginning of the film lives, he picks up a book, True and False Conversion. And I think the subtitle is like a debate on atheism or something like that. So the film is clearly wanting us to pay attention to this idea of what true conversion really is. And it clearly, I guess, thinking about it now, one thing that true conversion doesn't do, it doesn't say, and this is the point at which I'll stop. I'll convert this much, and no more. I'll convert enough to be on this side of the line of grave sin, but I'm not going to go any further than that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that might be something that is at work in the film. Just his wanting to stay in his sort of like intellectualized conception of of the moral life, his conceptualizing of the life of faith as a moral code, which we later get a bit of a sermon by a priest saying Christianity is not just a moral code.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you know, it's hard to sort of get around this because the film
there's a lot of complex ideas.
Yeah,
in
it's
really
rich.
I've watched it twice and I still don't see how everything connects.
Yeah, so the film is steeped in philosophical musings and references. Some of them not as apparently connected to the plot as others. But even in the back and forth among the characters, there's a real, vivacious, like hunger for grasping the concepts that are at work in people's lives. It's really exciting, actually. If I can just kind of make an aside, is that for a film that it just involves so much talking, so much dialogue, so much just sitting around and discussing, it keeps you on the edge of your seat.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so it's hard because I feel like you can draw out so much from what's said. I mean, you just in, laying out what you were thinking about all of this, you're referencing books that he's picking up and the sermon that he's hearing from the priest and then conversations that he's having. And it's like, it's a really sweeping kind of expose of these concerns. And like chance, they talk a lot about chance and how that operates in life. They talk about grace. It's interesting in that dormitory with Francoise, he pushes back on her when she says, well, for me, I get suspicious when things are going too well. And he says, well, don't you believe in grace? So he acknowledges in that moment that grace is at work. He says, that's sinning against hope. And one of the things that he keeps repeating is that for me, the decisions are easy. I make up my mind ahead of time. And then, when the situations arise, the choice is clear. My conscience is clear. I mean, she critiques him on this, saying that, well, that can't be all that grace is about, to just shore up a clear conscience. But I think that there's something admirable in this character in that he has a kind of purity of heart, even if it's a purity of half-heartedness. It's like, it's a kind of single-mindedness, a kind of, on the one hand, it may be a kind of despair of grace. On the other hand, it may be a kind of acceptance of, where he's at in life. I recalled as I was watching this, that there was a time in my life when I was just a smoker. I was just going to be a cigarette smoker. I wasn't going to spend time, hemming and hawing and wondering should I be smoking or should I not be smoking? I was like, okay, right now I'm a cigarette smoker and that's it.
Yeah.
And I think I was better off for it. And I think that now I'm more able to say, okay, now I'm not. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that I think that, especially for anybody who hasn't seen the film, I don't want to give the wrong impression that this character we're talking about is kind of like, that he doesn't have anything noble going on. Actually, I think he's quite sympathetic, and we find ourselves in his corner more often than not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Matthew, we've been talking a lot about this guy. Was there anything that sparked for you, or anything you want to jump in on?
Yeah, it's played by an actor whose name is also Jean-Louis, so there's a certain identification there of the character and the actor, but there's a great distinction in that the actor was an atheist and saw him, Jean-Louis Trintignant saw himself as he's an atheist. He saw himself as, kind of hip, free-thinking guy, very unlike this bourgeois character, bourgeois Catholic engineer he plays. But I think that dissonance between the actor and the character, in terms of their faith, in terms of their self-conception, really helps draw out the ambivalence and hesitation of the character. Works very well. As you say, our hero is very interested in chance, the workings of chance. Early on, there's the momentous meeting between Vidal, who's the communist old pal of our Catholic hero. They have a chance meeting, and then of course there's the somewhat chance. There's a fairly important chance meeting of Jean-Louis and of Francoise. Right after his night at Maud's. So chance is very important in the film. They talk about it a lot. And what is this chance? Well, the way that I understand that is just through a motto of Rohmer's, not expressed in this film, but that he expressed elsewhere. Everything is fortuitous except chance, or everything is pure luck in life except the actual workings of luck. And so what is beyond luck, or what's guiding all the luck we have? Well, that would be Providence, right? Providence is guiding it. So the film plays with the idea that happenstance can actually be about can follow a certain logic that's very striking. And the film doesn't make this claim, but I do think for Rohmer, the filmmaker, behind chance there is a benevolent intelligence that is leading us to certain things. And the way you can see that probably in this film is that through Jean-Louis' near miss, almost sleeping with the woman he spends the night with, Maud, he is perhaps able to gain a greater understanding for the woman he ends up marrying, Francoise. He's also able to give her a sense of humor and relieve her sense of guilt about her past sins. Not because she doesn't think that they are sins, but at the end of the film, we see her. I'm afraid we're having a bit of a spoiler here, but just as our hero Jean-Louis almost sleeps with Maud, the woman he has seen earlier in the film, the woman who he is pursuing and who he later manages to meet, she has been carrying on an affair with the husband of Maud, and
which partially led to their divorce.
Right, and Jean-Louis first sees Francoise, the young blonde woman, in church, where she seems to be quite moved by the Mass. And she's probably conscience-stricken or in a heightened emotional state because of this affair, which is giving her some reasons to think about religious matters. And so we see her kind of go from the seriousness we glimpse in the first Mass scene to a great pensiveness at the end of the film as she worries that her husband, at that time Jean-Louis, by that time they're married at the end of the film. Jean-Louis marries, we don't see him marry, but at the end of the film, there's a coda, and he has married Francoise, the blonde girl. And they happen to run into Maud again on the beach. So 5 years later, our engineer is happily married to the young woman, and he runs into the woman he almost slept with that night. And Francois is quite worried that he will have learned that she carried on an affair with the husband of Maud. And he does learn that, but he manages to set her mind at ease. And I think somehow through this very, very unlikely kind of love quadrangle where you almost slept with the woman who was married to the man that your future wife was sleeping with, very unlikely love quadrangle, but through its kind of absurd symmetry, maybe he's able to help Francois to get over her sorrow at that sin and to maybe see some humor in it. So maybe that's the providential working in the film.
Yeah, because he's talking about chance and how, circumstances or his personality or his luck with women or whatever has prevented him from having one night stands, although he has had more protracted affairs with women he was in love with in the past. But, when he describes this in the two scenes at the end of the film, when he talks about his night at Maud's with Francoise, I think in one case he says, when I met you, I had just come from a woman's apartment and I'd slept with her. And then in the coda, 5 years later, he says, that was my last fling. And it's just interesting to me that in neither case does he qualify and say, well, we didn't actually have intercourse. He just takes responsibility for his own consent to that, even though it didn't actually happen. And somebody early says you don't take responsibility for things, and he's talking about chance and all these different things, as though chance, he admits that it doesn't make it a virtue on his part if chance is what's preventing these things from happening, but I still like the fact that he just sort of doesn't qualify it. He just takes responsibility for his own inner movement of soul, in the matter.
Right.
And I think that speaks to a certain growth and also to a certain compassion in identifying himself with Francoise, who has, because as you say, Matthew, it is providential in that enabling him to have compassion and be understanding, because if he had just had affairs before his reversion, as opposed to, having affairs while claiming to be Catholic or having, having a relationship of the sort that Francoise had, because he said he can't understand infidelity. In this case, he actually falls after he's claiming already to have converted. And so that gives him a greater solidarity with her than he otherwise would have had. I think.
Right. Yeah. And he does change through the course of the film. In fact, most dramatically, as he's leaving his night at Maud's the next morning and runs into Francoise, that's when he finally approaches her. That's when he finally, asks her out. And he says he does so, despite all of his principles. He says that he's acting against his principles and just approaching this woman and asking, how can I get to know you? But in saying that, he's echoing something that was said to him during his night at Maud's. So there's already sort of like a connection being drawn there that somehow this night at Maud's has kind of facilitated or encouraged or shifted something inside of him that is now enabling him to approach Francoise. At the beginning of the film, when we're first introduced to this kind of this kind of archetypal arrangement of the man, loving from afar. He's following her after Mass, and Matthew, you mentioned it's kind of stalky. He's kind of like a stalker in this moment, but he's driving behind her at a distance, and it's like, what's your deal, man? Like, you can't approach her normally. He has a chance to after Mass, but instead he gets in his car, he drives behind her, and then of course he ends up losing her. And so there's kind of like a thwarted sense there right at the beginning, that something is stopping him. And I think that the film gives us reason to think that somehow Maud has encouraged him to do this. But then still later, when he runs into Maud again, the kind of graciousness with which he greets her, and then the graciousness with which he treats his wife, having had this realization of who the man that she had carried on this affair with was, totally speaks to the real love that he has for his wife in that final moment. I had on the brain when I was watching this, one of Tolkien's letters to his son. I'm doing some preliminary work on those, because those will probably come out in a forthcoming audiobooks episode. But in this particular letter, he, talks about love finally being an engaging of the will. And that's what we see Jean-Louis doing at the end. That it would be so easy in any other movie to sort of cast this as, reason for him to doubt his marriage, or to, wistfully, remember his night with Maud, the real love, the real soulmate. But I think that instead at the end, what we get is a recognition that the real soulmate, and here I'm quoting Tolkien's letter, is the one you're married to. And we get this beautiful final picture of him and his wife and their son running off into the water at the beach. And I just think it's such a beautiful ending. It's such a hopeful ending, coming out of all of this sort of moral ambiguity and kind of fallenness, that it totally has the mark of providence, of grace, of the workings of grace, and of conversion. Because certainly, while it's totally possible for conversion to happen in a dramatic sort of moment of decision, I think that for a lot of people, it's a slow, steady progress that becomes clear in retrospect, but that at any given moment might not be super obvious. And this is something that Jean-Louis recognizes in himself. He says, I don't pay attention to any one particular act. He says, a life is made of whole cloth, which I think is a very trusting way of looking at one's life. And he also acknowledges that every woman that he's ever had a relationship with has awoken, I think he says, attitudes in himself that he wouldn't have had cause to examine before, that each was kind of like a step along the path of conversion. When he's pushed back on that, saying, well, you could have just focused on the moral, spiritual elements without the physical, he says, well, yeah, but if those moral elements wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have been aware of them if it hadn't been for the physical, which again seems to me to be a very Christian conception of things. So in that final sermon, we get like 2 or 3 sermons in this film, but in the final one, the priest is preaching, and Francoise and Jean-Louis are there listening, and he says, yeah, Christianity is not a moral code. It's a way of life, and it's an adventure, an adventure of holiness. So I think that that's kind of what we're seeing is the making of a saint, a maybe mediocre saint, a half-hearted saint, a reluctant saint even, because that's another thing that the priest acknowledges in his sermon, is that sometimes saints proceed fearfully along the road, fearful of the next steps. And Jean-Louis and Francoise kind of like look over at each other in the pews. Yeah. So I don't know. It's like I said, it's hard to kind of totally lock this all up. Like there's one sort of clear statement being made in this film, but it really gives you a lot to think about. And it has the odor of truth to it, that there's, for all of its kind of, stylized conventions, how often are you sitting around having these really cogent philosophical debates, with someone you've just met or whatever. It still has this truthfulness to it, and I think especially in the way that these patterns of providence begin to emerge and the connections that are made. In anything else, this might be like melodramatic or kind of soap opera-y, like, oh, my wife is the one who broke up your marriage, and it seems almost tacky, but here somehow it works,
Well, there's a line earlier in the film where he runs into, oh gosh, what's his friend's name?
Vidal,
yeah. For the first time in years, and they said, it's so unlikely that we would meet, we never run into each other in our normal circles. And he says, well, yes, so that means that, because they're both at a restaurant they've never been to before. And he says, well, that means that, it'd be more likely for us to run into each other when we're both going out of our normal circle.
Yeah, right.
And so I think that is echoed too in that coincidence. And I use that in like the literal, just the literal sense of that word, of, him having his night with Maud and Francoise having had an affair with Maud's ex-husband. These are people who are on the moral margins, so they're more likely to find each other. This sort of coincidence may be more likely to happen. It's a small town,
right?
And they're both on the moral margins. Both of these pairs. And so they're all going off the reservation. And
Absolutely,
you might find each other more likely.
That's right.
So that's sort of how I see that. As well.
Yeah, a couple of things that really strike me about this film. One is just how beautiful it is visually. I believe the cinematography is done by Nestor Almendros, who was one of Rohmer's great collaborators. Also worked on La Collection News, which preceded this film. And
he also did Days of Heaven, Terrence Malick's first film, which is one of the most visually beautiful films ever.
He did Days of Heaven, which is gorgeous. So great collaboration. And one thing that I think can be said about this film, I don't think this is my observation. I think I read it somewhere. It's almost a color film, in that black and white are the basic elements of the film. We're often dealing in these dualities. Is it the we have, of course, the dark-haired Maud, and then we have the blonde Francoise, and then we have the dark stone of the cathedral, this lava rock, and then we also have the white snow that falls on Clermont-Ferrand. And so black and white. It's not just the way the film is shot. It's actually, those are kind of really the governing colors. And I think that there's actually, the car of Jean-Louis is white. I think many of the things, we have a white bedspread in Maud's apartment. We have other things that are black and white, and that even if the film were shot in color, we would see, I think, quite a bit of black and white in terms of the objects that are actually being shown to us. So it's just wonderfully shot and so well conceived visually. And the those blacks and whites, many of which are natural, really support the basic kind of sort of dualism of the film. This woman or that, Catholicism or free thought, things like this. And then, in terms of those dualities in the film, it's striking that though it's called My Night at Maud's, and I think justly so, there are actually two nights at the places of two different women. After the night at Maud's, he spends the night at Francoise. He's once again basically snowed in, and he doesn't spend it in the same bed as her. He spends it in another apartment in her student dorm room. But through the course of this, we get a great contrast between these two women, and we see him interact with them very differently. When he's at Maud's, he's speaking very, very openly and frankly. And with this younger woman, he's more discreet, more reserved, more courtly, I think you could say. He also instructs her. He is maybe 15 years older than her. He's an engineer in his mid-30s.
12 years older.
Yeah, he's an engineer in his mid-30s, and she's in her early 20s. She's a student. So he tells her how to make tea. He shows her his excellent method for making tea. He doesn't teach Maud any tricks. Maud is very much his equal, not just in age, but also probably roughly equal with him in income, being a pediatrician, equal to him in education. She has an advanced degree just as he does. Her apartment is very elegantly set up. I don't think he has a whole lot he can teach her. But with Francois, he stands he is her superior in age, in income, in education, and he knows his way around the world much better. He does then learn in time that Francois has a little more experience than he realized sexually, but he still very much feels that he is her superior. So there's a contrast in his relations with the two women. With Maud, he interacts with her as an equal on terms of, in very open and even frank terms. They're talking about their love affairs very openly, and with Francois, though they discuss their past affairs, it's much more tortured, and they're unequal, and they stand. He treats her much more like a woman whose sensibilities have to be carefully guarded. So he acts toward her in a much more chivalrous way, or with much more kind of concern. And maybe some of this is a bit overdone on his part. You could argue that. I don't think the film necessarily dictates strong conclusions on all these matters, but he interacts with the two women very differently. And I think the film is justly called My Night at Maud's, because the night at Maud's is a lot more interesting and compelling than the night he spends with the woman he eventually marries. So what are we to make of
Right.
what are we to make of that? Because really, Maud, much more charismatic. A lot, just much more kind of interesting in what she has to say. He seems to open up to her in a way that he doesn't, with Francois. But Rohmer, in this film at least, shows us, a man who seems, happier and more fulfilled, entering into a relationship that's maybe less open, less frank, less one of equality, less one of, pure kind of companionship at the level of taste, experience, intellect, and is more a relationship really of inequality, or of a certain form of hierarchy. When the man is older than the woman, the man is more experienced than the woman, the man makes more than the woman, the man carefully guards the woman's sensibilities in a way that he simply didn't with Maud. And of course, with Francois, that's when he marries and they have the child, and so there's quite a difference there, and I think it's presenting us with two different versions of life, or modes of interaction, which are can be aren't limited to romantic matters, and those modes are frankness, which he experiences with Maud, and discretion or reserve, which is more characteristic of his relationship with Francois. And in terms of this reserve, we encounter Maud in her apartment initially, and she's dressed in what looks like a soft cashmere dress, and we see Francois either in a drafty church or out on the street on her motorbike, and she's generally wearing a coat. And this coat actually has 3 buckles across the belts running all the way around the coat that then buckle, and then there's a zipper beneath them. So she is really kind of locked up there. She's got a few buckles and she's got a zipper, and then when we see her take off the coat,
he plays with them a lot when they're talking.
Right, and then
I noticed.
Yeah, so he does manage to undo a few of the buckles, as things progress. But then when they're back at her apartment, she's wearing a somewhat scratchier wool sweater instead of the somewhat finer cashmere, indicating Maud's greater refinement, her greater probably receptivity to advances, her greater wealth, and so with Francois, she's a little harder to get to, maybe a little less fascinating simply as a mind or as a personality, at least for this viewer.
Yeah, right, totally.
But you still understand very clearly the logic that he needs to end up with this woman.
Yeah.
Well, the final scene is her running off, taking off an overcoat and running off in her swimsuit
Yeah.
into the
Good point.
water.
Yeah.
Good point.
Well, what we just heard was next level film criticism. I feel like when you're observing the The outfits on that level, I feel like that's where we need to get. How many times have you seen this, Matthew?
I first saw it when I was a student in college, and all my friends had gone skiing on winter break, and I didn't know how to ski and didn't have money to go skiing, so I would go into the film lab and just watch movies, that you couldn't check out or whatever. And so I watched this movie years ago, and I've seen it a few times since.
That's great. Yeah, I for all of the talking that goes on in this film, it is very visually interesting at times as well. There are a lot of visual cues, I feel like, that are given, and you already mentioned
Body
the sort
language.
of. Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, we can talk about the cinematography. There are times when things are conveyed visually, right? So for instance, at the very beginning in the pursuit in the car, we've got the camera in the car. It's a long shot as they're winding through these streets and he's chasing her on the motorbike. It's a really exciting sequence, and you're immediately invested. But also there are other little compelling images that come up throughout that sometimes interrupt the conversation. Like when the little girl, Maud's daughter, comes out for a moment out of bed just to see the lights on the Christmas tree. And Maud plugs it in. She looks. She unplugs it. Is that enough? Okay, go to bed. And it's like, what is that moment about? But there's I think there's a real sense that Rohmer is both a philosopher and a poet in the way that he's linking images and scenarios and concepts and so it is very much a work of film. There's
a lot that could be said about the body language and the camera moves in that night at Maud's. I don't know how much we want to get into it.
One thing I wanted to say about the camera was that there's sometimes these, it's almost like the camera forgets other people in the room. That's
right,
times.
Which I think is really cool.
It is really cool because you'll have a conversation maybe between two people and the camera will just linger on one of them.
And then one of them will move into the frame unexpectedly.
Yeah. Or there will be three people together and the camera will just pan to two of them to the total exclusion of another. So it focuses, the way the camera frames and focuses your attention on the dynamics that are going on, between two parties of the three or just with the responses of one party as another is speaking. In many other films, we would get these cuts back and forth so that we're seeing at any given moment the person who's speaking in a conversation. But there will be a long time when you'll just watch one person. It's almost like I don't know, like something you would see in a documentary with like an interview or something like that.
There's a lot of just like little theatrical moments, like when just to get people to move around, like when she keeps asking, "Oh, can you open the window?
Yeah.
Can you light my cigarette?"
Right.
Things like that. Just things that change the dynamic in subtle ways.
That's right.
And one of my favorite moments in the scene, but the night at Maud scene after Vidal has left, she's talking about how she and her ex-husband, had both had affairs, and the man that she took as a lover died suddenly in a car accident, and she's like really sad about it. And there's like a movement of light across her face that makes you think that Jean-Louis has come closer to her. You almost expect that. You would expect that, right? She's just revealed this sad thing. He's been moving closer to her and further away at different points, or sometimes they're quite close together.
Right.
And there's this movement of light across her face that makes you think that maybe he's moving closer. And then it cuts to him, and he is, or she says, "Is it still snowing out there?" And he's all the way across the room with his back turned to her, looking out the window. Which is just a great little moment.
The film
kind of fakes you out.
The choreography, especially in the apartment at Maud's, it does feel like you're watching a play because, I don't know how long we're at Maud's, but it dominates the film. It's the title, but it's also the centerpiece. And so we spend a long time at Maud's, and it feels like you're watching something off Broadway almost. But also in these sort of micro interactions that go on, little gestures. Like the actors, man, the actors in this movie are amazing. They really know how to stick the landing at points. So there'll be like this back and forth, this talking about philosophical concepts, and then all of a sudden, boom, something like human and real and immediate happens between the two of them. And as a viewer, you're just like the air goes out of the room. This happens between Jean-Louis and Maud a few times that during that night. But the first time, if I can remember, it's, she sits down across from him and kind of leans forward and sticks her feet out so that they're kind of almost between his. And it's just that physical relationship that she puts herself into with him. It's so provocative, but so subtle, and it just, to me, is it shows the hand of a masterful director. Masterful acting, of course, especially because there's such a scrutiny. Like the camera really scrutinizes the responses of people, because we talked about this lingering. So you're watching all the ways that they're reacting. So not just what they're saying, but also what's being said to them. And Maud and Jean-Louis, the actors playing those two characters are just incredible. Oh gee, there was one more thing I wanted to say on that point. I guess just that this is another way in which the film really keeps you at the edge of your seat and keeps things exciting, because underneath the words, there's a lot of subtext. There's a lot that's going on. Yeah. It's like, bowling balls are being hurled underneath the table at one another.
We like to warn people. There's a little bit of nudity in this film.
Very brief, but
very
it's
brief,
there.
Less so than Andrei Rublev, for example.
Sure.
Probably had the most screen time of nudity of any of the films we've discussed so far. So I don't think that would actually that would be what would have prevented this film from being on the Vatican film list. But he is known as Rohmer is known as having been a practicing Catholic. Now I'm told that most of his films are very mild in this respect. I think that in one of his other films, there's a sex scene, but I think other than that, a lot of his movies are rated G, from what I could tell on IMDb, or like PG, maybe not G, but like PG in the States. So I'm kind of curious, since you know more about him, Matthew. Well, somebody told me that he wouldn't, for example, in one of his other films where there was a sex scene, he wouldn't be in the room when it was being filmed. Like, he wrote it and he's the director. He decided it would be in the film, and yet he was really uncomfortable being in the room when it was being shot. So what do you make of that, with him being a Catholic? Like, what's up with the sort of seeming contradiction there?
Another of his films set around Christmas time, A Tale of Winter, occurred because the actress in that film was a nudist, maybe not a thorough one, but someone who was very interested in being nude and kind of displaying herself freely. So he, by saying something like that, he's indicating that it's not his choice, not something he would dictate to an actress, but instead is reflective of her own beliefs, her own principles. So understanding the use of nudity in Rohmer's films has to be seen in those terms. He presented it as something that would reflect the character of the actress herself, not something that he would dictate. And this is bound up with his general method for working with actresses and defining characters. So when he wanted to do a film, whether he had the idea for the film first, that would be the case. Other times he would really meet an actress first, and through a series of conversations with her or interactions with her, come up with the idea for a film. So in this film, the actress who plays Maud, she described the making of the film as just an extension of conversations that she was having with Rohmer. He would often invite actresses and actors, but especially actresses, sometimes called the Rohmerians, over to his office, where in the afternoon they would have tea. And at the offices for his film company, along with other staff members there. And so there would be this sort of almost salon that Rohmer would have with his actresses. And he was very interested in their opinions, their thoughts, and often their thoughts would make it into the dialogue for his films. And so I guess it almost sounds like I'm presenting him as a little bit of a feminist here, but I think, much more than would be the case for most directors. He was really interested in getting a sense of who the actress was and letting that personality inform the role. So with the actress who plays Maud, who was herself very modern, free-thinking young woman, and the actress who the heroine in Tale of Winter, where there's somewhat more sense of nudity. You can see the nudity is something that those women were, Rohmer would present that as something extending from their own personalities, their own principles, their own sense of who they were, and he might actually be right about that. He was certainly very interested in presenting the opinions of his actresses, and he actually ran into that in one case with The Adventures of Renette and Mirabelle, one of his films, which he because of the way he would collaborate with his actresses, it was so extensive that in this one case, The Adventures of Renette and Mirabelle, he was actually almost dragged into court by an actress who claimed that she deserved greater royalties for the film because she had helped to create it, which is maybe she was onto something there. Most other actresses who'd worked with Rohmer that were horrified that she had done that and tended to take his side.
Interesting. Well, I'm not convinced that works as a justification for nudity in a film, or much less a sex scene. But not that this is characteristics of his whole filmography, obviously. But it sounds like he wasn't really comfortable with it personally, which is interesting. But it's also interesting to hear about his method, because he does have a reputation for being one of the greatest writers of female characters and directors of women.
Yeah. Whether nudity in film can be justified is not a question that Rohmer ever addressed, to my knowledge. But I think through his discussion of the nudity in Tale of Winter, you can maybe draw the conclusion that he thought it was something that maybe required justification or explanation. And then, it's worth pointing out that Eric Rohmer was not the name. It was the name of the director, but it was not the name of the man. His real name was Maurice Scherer, and he, throughout his whole life, concealed from his mother the fact that he was a director, one of the most famous directors in France. He carried on a bizarre pretense that he was actually a school teacher. And this, whatever you make of it, and I don't know exactly what to make of it, strongly suggests that he viewed filmmaking as not an altogether respectable profession, and not something that he was eager to talk to his mother about. It's funny because Rohmer's brother was a professor and a very outspoken advocate for free love and homosexuality. His brother was a very out and open gay man. I think he didn't carry on any kind of pretenses in the way that Rohmer did. So that there were very different characters, and Rohmer was far and away the more conservative and Catholic of the two. But I think he maybe had some doubts. Maybe he had some doubts about, I don't know if he had doubts about how Christian filmmaking was, but you could certainly say that he had doubts about how respectable it was.
Matthew, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We really, you were a great commentator on this film, and we hope to have you back again sometime.
Love to come back. Thanks for your work. Keep it up.
Okay, so Matt had a time limit and had to go, but before we end the podcast, I just wanted to talk about some possible reasons why this film is set at Christmas time.
Yes, it is Christmas after all.
It's clearly important to Rohmer that the film is set at Christmas because he made a point of filming the days that this film is set, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. In fact, this film, for that reason, the film was delayed by a year because Jean-Louis Trintignant, or whatever, however you pronounce his name, the actor was not available on those days to shoot. So clearly it was significant to the director, the time that this film is set.
It looks like he's filming a real Christmas mass at one point.
Yes.
There's like a little kid looking up at the camera, like, what is that camera doing in here?
Well, first of all, yeah, the beginning of the film, we see Jean-Louis at his house. Then we see him driving. There's a number of long driving scenes in the film. And then we just get one of the longest liturgy scenes I've seen in a film. Yeah. Because usually when liturgies are shown in the film, in a film, it's almost always people receiving communion or the homily. Right. Right? You don't usually get that much of
you might get like a few words or something.
Yeah. So we get the whole, it's like sort of, I don't know if it's continuous. Where does it start? Does it start at the offertory or does it start a little later? But at any rate, the conclusion of the liturgical scene is you're seeing the Agnus Dei and the elevation of the host before communion. So we get quite a bit of that, and it's a Novus Ordo. This is early on. I mean, he spends a long time on the liturgy before we get any preaching, and that's interesting, and kind of leads me to the kind of maybe this is what I see as part of the significance of Christmas. Now, of course, the story is partially about conversion. It's partially about being reborn in Christ, which is in one of the later sermons that we hear in the film. And but I think part of it is like this concreteness, because we have this character who's very in his head, and he's talking about Christianity as a moral code and things like that. But I think that the sort of incarnational aspect of it is important in that, like, his development as a character comes from his relationship, his being put into a situation with, I'm thinking mainly of Francoise, but of course Maud to an extent as well, but Francoise just having to love her and having to be considerate of her and growing in that way, rather than sort of all the discussion about Pascal and stuff that you get for a lot of the film. But there is the first thing we see from Pascal when he's opening the book up in the bookstore is this passage. They began as though they did believe, with holy water and masses, etc. You too may follow that way to unthinking belief. And then there's a little bit of a dialogue. That's what I fear. Why? What have you got to lose? It's the way to diminish the passions, which are your stumbling blocks. And so that's the first of Pascal that we're introduced to in the film. It's the first time he enters the film, and so clearly, and it's also the only extensive direct quote we get from Pascal in the film. Mm-hmm. So clearly that's significant, and I see it as relating to the fact that we do get the film beginning with this extended sequence of just the liturgy itself. I don't know where to go with that, but I think the sort of the concreteness of that and the simpler aspects of the faith is important.
I think that one of the things that long sequence of the Mass at the beginning of the film does is situates everything that happens afterwards within the drama of a normal Christian lived experience, right? Like, that this is incarnational. This is in the trenches of life. This is a Catholic who in the morning is going to Mass, and then in the evening is, being seduced, and that it returns to the church throughout. Yeah. And then also one of the things that's said by the priest is that Christmas is the guarantee of our hope. And I think that this film is a lot about hope. That in his own way, though it may seem that Jean-Louis is despairing of the grace to be a saint, in his own way, he is hopeful and trusting that he's going to be carried forward. Mm-hmm. And I think even more so than he can imagine. And the image that sticks with me the most in this film, it's just beautiful, is when he's in Maud's apartment and he's talking about how he can't see himself as being a saint, but I forget what he says. He says something like,
pray for the grace to see the possibility of being a saint.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in that very moment, he's in the center of the frame. He's standing in front of a lamp, and the light is just beautiful. It's like rays are emanating from behind him. And it's almost like in that moment, we see the possibility for him to be a saint. It's almost like an image of iconography.
Oh.
So yeah, I think that there is this hope, and it's a hope that's demonstrated in the film, that even these fallen moments are redeemed, that Christ enters into the complexity and the messiness of this man's life and of the lives of everybody there, and works, that love is there, and that love transforms. So yeah, it might not be a Christmas Carol, but it's definitely Christmas and incarnational in its concerns.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you've been watching on YouTube, please do subscribe. And I think our next episode will be probably a review of the new Macbeth film.
Oh yeah, I hope so.
By Joel Cohen, his first time going out on his own, apart from his brother as a director, starring Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand as Lord and Lady Macbeth.
Yeah, really excited to see this one.
Yeah, and then after that, we'll be coming back with Decalogue 10 in the new year, and some other fun stuff, going back to the Vatican film list soon. So thanks again for listening, and everybody have a wonderful remainder of last few days of Advent, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year.